Did a queen ever truly rule? Did a woman in the 12th century, a time of knights and kings, ever hold more power than the man she married? What happens when a duchess, ruler of a land larger and richer than the king's, is forced to become a wife? What becomes of her power? And what if, after being cast aside, she marries an even more powerful man, a future king, and builds an empire with him, only to be locked away by him for 15 years? How does a woman, a queen, a prisoner, emerge from a stone cell in her 60s to rule that empire in her husband's and son's names, to crush rebellions, raise ransoms, and secure a dynasty for a family that had betrayed her? Number 18. Why was a teenage girl the most powerful person in France? And Eleanor was 15 years old when her father died. He was William X, Duke of Aquitaine. He died far from home on a pilgrimage in Spain. His death in 1137 instantly made his young daughter the most powerful heiress in all of Europe. She was now Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine and Gascony, and Countess of Poitou. Her inheritance was not some small piece of land. It was a massive territory. The Duchy of Aquitaine stretched from the Loire River in central France all the way down to the Pyrenees Mountains bordering Spain. It covered most of southwestern France. It was larger, wealthier, and more culturally vibrant than the personal lands of the King of France, Louis VI. The king's domain, the Île-de-France, was a small territory centered around Paris. Aquitaine was a prize beyond measure. Her husband-to-be, also named Louis, was the heir to the French throne. He lived in a cold, gray Paris. His world was serious and religious. He had been raised for a life in the church, not a life on the throne. His older brother had died in a freak accident, making him the heir. He was pious, quiet, and uncertain. Eleanor was the opposite. She grew up in Poitiers and Bordeaux in the sunny south. Her court was famous for its music, poetry, and art. The troubadours, poet-musicians sang of courtly love and chivalry. Her world was one of color, culture, and sophisticated ideas. She was educated, intelligent, and confident. She was a ruler from birth. He was a king by accident. Before he died, Eleanor's father knew his daughter would be in danger. A female ruler with such a vast territory was a target. Every ambitious lord would want to control her and her lands. So he made a will. He named the King of France, Louis VI, as her guardian. He asked the king to find her a suitable husband. The king did exactly that. He chose his own son. The arrangement was perfect for the French crown. By marrying Eleanor to his heir, Louis VI would bring the massive territory of Aquitaine under the control of the French monarchy. It was a political masterstroke. The wedding happened just weeks after her father's death. Almost immediately after, Louis VI died. Eleanor's young, uncertain husband became King Louis VII of France, and Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, became Queen of France. But the power dynamic was strange. In a normal royal marriage, the queen brought a dowry and became the king's consort. Her lands would be absorbed by his, but Aquitaine was different. It was Eleanor's. The lords of Aquitaine were her vassals, not Louis's. They swore allegiance to her. The traditions, laws, and language of Aquitaine were distinct from those of northern France. Louis might have been king, but in the south, Eleanor was the true ruler. She was not just a queen who happened to come with land. She was a duchess, a sovereign in her own right, who was also, for a time, the Queen of France. Louis was king in Paris. But when they traveled south to her domains, he was merely the duchess's husband. He did not understand the culture. He did not have the personal loyalty of the powerful southern barons. She did. From the very beginning, she was more of a ruler in her own lands than he ever could be. He held the title of king, but she held the real power in the larger, richer half of the kingdom. Number 17. Did a queen really belong on a crusade? In 1145, news reached Europe that the crusader state of Edessa had fallen. The Pope called for a new crusade, the Second Crusade, to reclaim the territory. And King Louis VII of France, driven by religious fervor and perhaps guilt over a past military action where a church full of people was burned, eagerly took up the call. He announced his intention to lead an army to the Holy Land. It was expected that the king would go to war. It was not expected that his wife, the queen, would insist on going with him, but Eleanor did. This was not a case of a wife simply accompanying her husband. Eleanor announced that she would go as the feudal leader of her soldiers from Aquitaine. She had the right. The lords and knights of her duchy were her vassals. They owed her military service. She intended to lead them. This was an astonishing move. Queens did not command armies. They were supposed to stay home, manage the household, and pray for their husband's success. Eleanor saw it differently. Aquitaine was contributing a huge number of troops to the crusade. She was their duchess. She would go with them. Louis was against the idea. His advisors were horrified. They argued it was improper. They said a woman, even a queen, would be a distraction and a burden on a long, dangerous military campaign. But Eleanor was stubborn. She was also powerful. The Aquitanian contingent was essential to the success of the French army. If she refused to let them go, Louis's crusade would be significantly weakened. So she went. She and her ladies-in-waiting supposedly dress as Amazons, though this is likely an exaggeration. What is certain is that she was there not just as a queen, but as a commander. She had her own baggage train, her own knights, her own standard. The journey east was difficult. The German army, which had left earlier, was nearly destroyed. The French army, under Louis, had to march through hostile Byzantine territory and then face the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. It was here that Eleanor's kingly qualities and Louis's lack of them became clear. Eleanor had an uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, who was the ruler of Antioch, a major crusader city. He was a seasoned warrior and a shrewd political operator. Eleanor's plan was strategically sound. She argued they should travel to Antioch, rest, resupply, and plan their next move with Raymond. And Raymond's knowledge of the region was invaluable. From Antioch, they could attack the real center of Muslim power in the area, Aleppo, which would secure the Crusader states. Louis refused. He was a pilgrim king, not a strategist. His sole focus was to get to Jerusalem and pray. He saw Eleanor's suggestion as a worldly distraction. He suspected that she and her uncle were planning something for their own benefit, perhaps to create a larger domain for their family in the East. He ignored her counsel, he ignored Raymond's military advice. Instead, he chose a more direct and dangerous route to Jerusalem. The decision was a disaster. His army was ambushed by the Turks in the mountains. They suffered terrible losses. The French forces limped into Antioch, defeated and demoralized. Louis's piety had proven to be a poor substitute for military strategy. Eleanor's practical, strategic mind had been ignored, and the crusade paid the price. In the middle of a war, she had thought like a general. He had thought like a monk. Number 16. How do you fire a king? The Second Crusade was a complete failure. The relationship between Eleanor and Louis, already strained, was broken beyond repair. They had argued publicly in Antioch. Rumors spread, likely encouraged by Louis's advisors, that Eleanor had been unfaithful with her uncle Raymond. The charge was almost certainly false, a way to discredit a queen who had challenged the king's authority. But the damage was done. They barely spoke on the voyage home. They had 2 daughters, but no son. For a king, a male heir was everything. Louis saw the lack of a son as a sign of divine disapproval. Eleanor saw her marriage to the pious, ineffective Louis as a dead end. Upon their return to France, they lived separate lives. Eleanor wanted out. In the 12th century, divorce, as we know it, did not exist. The only way to end a marriage was to get an annulment from the church. An annulment meant the marriage was declared invalid from the start, as if it never happened. To get one, you needed a reason, a legal loophole. The most common one was consanguinity, which meant the husband and wife were too closely related by blood. Most European nobles were related in some way, so this was often a convenient excuse if both parties and the Pope agreed. Eleanor was the one who pushed for the annulment. Louis was reluctant at first. Losing Eleanor meant losing control of Aquitaine. It would make the French crown significantly weaker. But Eleanor was determined. She had no son with him. She had no respect for him as a leader. She was a duchess in her own right, and she wanted her freedom. She played her cards carefully. She knew that Louis also needed a male heir, and he was not going to get one from her. The pressure mounted. Finally, in March 1152, a council of bishops met. They granted the annulment on the grounds of consanguinity. Eleanor and Louis were fourth cousins, once removed. The marriage was dissolved. This was an act of incredible political will. A queen did not simply decide to leave a king, but Eleanor was not just a queen, she was the Duchess of Aquitaine. When the marriage ended, her lands reverted to her. She was once again the single powerful ruler of a vast territory. Louis had lost the greatest prize his family had ever acquired. He had failed to manage the crusade, and he had failed to manage his own marriage. Eleanor, on the other hand, had successfully navigated the complex rules of the church to free herself from a political and personal dead end. She was 30 years old, free, and in control of her own destiny and her vast lands. As she traveled back to her home in Poitiers, she had to evade attempts by other lords to kidnap and forcibly marry her. She was that powerful, that desirable. She had, in effect, fired her husband, the king, and taken her kingdom back. Number 15, who chooses their own king in 2 months. That is how long Eleanor remained single. Just 2 months after her marriage to King Louis VII was annulled, she did something even more shocking. She married again. But she was not given in marriage by a guardian or a king. She chose her husband herself. And her choice would change the face of Europe. Her new husband was Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was 11 years younger than her. He was ambitious, energetic, and brilliant. He also had a strong claim to the throne of England. This was not a marriage of love, though they may have been attracted to each other. It was a calculated political alliance of breathtaking scale. Eleanor had her vast duchy of Aquitaine. Henry controlled Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. Together, their territories formed a massive arc of land that dwarfed the personal domain of her ex-husband, the King of France. Their combined lands stretched from the border of Scotland down to Spain. When Henry became King of England, 2 years later, in 1154, this collection of territories would become known as the Angevin Empire. Louis VII was reportedly stunned and furious. He had been outmaneuvered completely. Not only had he lost Aquitaine, but now it was in the hands of his greatest rival. Henry was technically Louis's vassal for his lands in France, but the vassal was now far more powerful than his lord. The marriage created a political entity that would challenge the French crown for the next 300 years. Eleanor's decision was a kingly one. Kings made strategic alliances through marriage to expand their power and secure their borders. That is exactly what Eleanor did. She did not wait for her future to be decided for her. She took the most valuable asset she had, herself and her duchy, and leveraged it to create an empire. She saw in the young, dynamic Henry a partner who matched her own ambition and energy, a stark contrast to the indecisive Louis. By marrying Henry, she was not just choosing a husband, she was choosing a co-founder for an imperial dynasty. She was betting that together they could build something greater than either of them could achieve alone. She effectively chose the next King of England and, in doing so, created a new political map of Europe. She acted not as a pawn in the games of men, but as a player in her own right, moving her own pieces on the board. Number 14. How can a queen rule from the shadows? For the first decade or so of their marriage, Eleanor and Henry II worked as a team. They traveled constantly throughout their vast domains, from England to Normandy to Aquitaine. Eleanor gave Henry what he needed: most heirs. They had 8 children together, 5 of whom were sons. The future of the Plantagenet dynasty seemed secure. Henry was a brilliant and tireless ruler. He reformed the English legal system, asserted his authority over the barons, and was constantly on the move, administering his empire. But Eleanor was not content to be just a mother and a consort. She remained the Duchess of Aquitaine. Her southern lands were notoriously rebellious and difficult to govern. The lords of Aquitaine did not like being ruled by a northern king like Henry. They were loyal to Eleanor. Henry needed her to keep the peace. She often traveled to Aquitaine to hold court, hear disputes, and remind the unruly barons that she was their overlord. Well, Henry might have been the king, but in her own lands, her authority was paramount. More importantly, Henry relied on her to rule in his absence. He was frequently away from England, dealing with issues on the continent in France. During these times, Eleanor acted as regent. A regent is a person who rules a kingdom when the monarch is absent, ill, or too young. Eleanor was not just a figurehead. She was the active head of government. She issued official documents called rights in her own name. She presided over the King's Council. She heard legal cases and dispensed justice. She was, for all intents and purposes, the acting ruler of England. This was a position of immense trust and power. Henry was a king who jealously guarded his authority. The fact that he entrusted the governance of his kingdom to Eleanor shows how capable he knew she was. She understood the complexities of feudal law and administration. She knew the powerful families and how to manage them. She was not just keeping the throne warm for him, she was actively governing, making decisions that shaped the kingdom. While Henry was the architect of the Angevin Empire's legal and administrative reforms, Eleanor was often the one on the ground, making sure the machinery of government continued to run smoothly. She was more than a queen consort. She was a partner in power, a deputy king who could be trusted to wield royal authority with skill and intelligence. She showed that a queen could govern as effectively as any king. Number 13. Can you build a kingdom with poetry? By the late 1160s, the relationship between Eleanor and Henry had begun to sour. Henry's infidelities were a public secret, particularly his long-term relationship with Rosamund Clifford. The political partnership that had built an empire was cracking under personal strain. In 1168, they reached an arrangement, and Eleanor would return to her own lands in Aquitaine and establish her own court in the city of Poitiers. She would rule her duchy directly, with her favorite son, Richard, at her side. This was not a retirement. It was the beginning of one of the most remarkable periods of her life. The court she established in Poitiers became the cultural center of Europe. This was the era of the court of love. Here, Eleanor and her daughter Marie presided over a glittering circle of nobles, knights, poets, and artists. They promoted the ideals of chivalry and courtly love, ideas that had first blossomed in her grandfather's court in Aquitaine. The troubadours flocked to her. They wrote epic poems and sang songs about knights who performed great deeds for the love of a noble lady. But this was more than just parties and poetry. Eleanor was using culture as a tool of governance. She was creating a new code of behavior for the warrior aristocracy. The ideals of chivalry taught knights to be not just brutal fighters, but also loyal, honorable, and courteous, especially to women. The courts of love supposedly heard debates and passed judgments on romantic and ethical dilemmas, all based on these new ideals. While the historical reality of these courts is debated, their influence is not. The ideas that flourished in Eleanor's Poitiers court spread throughout Europe, shaping literature, art, and the very concept of romantic love for centuries to come. This was a form of power that her husband Henry, a man of law and war, did not fully understand. He built castles and created legal systems. Eleanor was building a culture. She was shaping the hearts and minds of her subjects. By making her court the most sophisticated and desirable place to be, she enhanced her own prestige and authority. She was ruling Aquitaine not just with laws and soldiers, but with ideas. She was creating a distinct identity for her duchy, separate from Henry's northern English-Norman world. She was acting as a true sovereign, fostering the arts and sciences to strengthen her realm, much like the great kings and emperors of history. She proved that a kingdom could be built not just on force, but on influence. Number 12. Why would a mother turn her sons against their father? By 1173, the sons of Henry and Eleanor were growing up. Henry, the eldest surviving son, had been crowned young king to rule alongside his father, but he had no real power and a small allowance. Richard was the Duke of Aquitaine in name, but his mother Eleanor held the real authority. Geoffrey was to be Duke of Brittany. John the youngest was called Lackland because his father had not yet given him any territory. The young men were ambitious, proud, and resentful of their father, who kept them on a tight leash and refused to delegate any meaningful power. Eleanor watched this family drama unfold from her court in Poitiers. Her own relationship with Henry was broken. He had taken her authority in Aquitaine for granted, and he continued his affair with Rosamund Clifford. She saw her son's frustration, and she saw an opportunity. She had always been fiercely protective of her own rights as Duchess of Aquitaine and of her son's inheritance. She felt Henry was hoarding power, treating their vast empire as his personal property rather than a family enterprise to be shared. So she made a fateful decision. She encouraged her son's rebellion. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 was a massive civil war that tore the Angevin Empire apart. The three eldest sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose up against their father. They were supported by a powerful coalition of enemies of Henry II, including King Louis VII of France, Eleanor's ex-husband, the King of Scotland, and many powerful English and continental barons. Well, Eleanor was the strategic and emotional heart of the rebellion. It was from her court in Poitiers that the plans were likely hatched. She used her influence to rally the lords of Aquitaine, who were always eager to fight against their northern king, to the cause of her sons. Her actions were a stunning betrayal of her husband, but in her eyes it was a fight for her own rights and the rights of her children. She was not acting as a subservient wife, she was acting as a rival monarch, a queen mother defending her dynasty's future against a tyrannical king. The revolt was her boldest move yet. She was risking everything. She was leading a coalition to unseat the most powerful king in Europe, who also happened to be her husband. Ultimately, the rebellion failed. Henry II was a brilliant military commander and a canny politician. He defeated his enemies one by one. The sons were forced to surrender and beg for their father's forgiveness. And Eleanor, she was captured as she tried to flee to the court of her ex-husband in Paris, disguised as a man. Her great gamble had failed, the king had won, but she had shown that she was willing to go to war with a king to protect what she believed was hers. It was the act of a monarch, not a consort. Of number 11. Can you rule a kingdom from a prison cell? After her capture in 1174, Henry II did not execute his wife. He did something that was, in some ways, worse. He made her disappear. For the next 15 years, Eleanor of Aquitaine was a prisoner. She was moved between various castles in England and Normandy, including Winchester and Sarum. She was kept under close guard. Her political life was over. Or so Henry thought. Henry's decision to imprison her, rather than divorce or discard her, is a testament to her power. He could not risk letting her go. Free, she was a political force, a rallying point for his enemies and his rebellious sons. He still needed her as the Duchess of Aquitaine to maintain his legal claim over the territory, so he could not get rid of her, but he could not trust her. Imprisonment was his only solution. He had to neutralize a rival power. You do not imprison someone who is powerless. You imprison a threat. Eleanor, even in her 50s and 60s, was a threat to the king. During her long years of captivity, she was largely cut off from the world. She missed the weddings of her children and the births of her grandchildren. Her son, the young King Henry, died of dysentery after another rebellion against his father. Eleanor was briefly released to attend his funeral, a heartbreaking reunion under guard, but even in prison, she was not entirely forgotten. She remained a symbol. The troubadours wrote poems about their imprisoned duchess. Her sons, especially her favorite Richard, continued to resent their father for his treatment of their mother. Her imprisonment was a constant source of tension within the family and the empire. In a strange way, her captivity was a form of political action. Her refusal to submit, her silent endurance, was a constant reproach to Henry's authority. He could control her body, but he could not erase her status or her influence. She was the absent queen, the captive duchess, a living martyr to her husband's tyranny. Her presence, even locked away, shaped the politics of the Angevin Empire. Henry could win battles and reform laws, but he could not solve the problem of his wife. He ruled his empire, but he was haunted by the queen he kept in a cage. Her endurance through those 15 years was an act of incredible strength, a silent reign from a stone room. Number 10. How does a 67-year-old woman take back an empire? In 1189, King Henry II died. He died a broken man, defeated in his final war against his son Richard and the King of France. On his deathbed, he learned that his favorite son, John, had also betrayed him. Henry's last words were supposedly, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." The moment Henry died, everything changed for Eleanor. Richard the Lionheart, her favorite son, was now King of England. One of his very first acts was to order his mother's release. After 15 years of imprisonment, Eleanor, now 67 years old, was free. And she did not retire to a convent to live out her final years in peace. She exploded back onto the political scene. She traveled from her prison at Winchester to Westminster. She did not wait for Richard to arrive from France. She took control. Acting on Richard's authority, she ruled England as regent. This was not a quiet, symbolic role. And she was the government. She received the oaths of fealty from the lords and clergy on behalf of the new king. She ordered a general amnesty, releasing many people who had been unjustly imprisoned under Henry II's harsh forest laws. This made her incredibly popular with the common people. She traveled the country, holding court, ensuring a smooth transition of power. She was preparing the kingdom for her son's arrival. When Richard finally arrived in England, he officially confirmed her power. He was crowned king, but he had little interest in the day-to-day business of governing England. His passion was for the crusade. He planned to leave for the Holy Land as soon as possible. He trusted one person to rule his kingdom, in his absence, his mother. For the years that Richard was away on the Third Crusade, Eleanor was the effective ruler of England. She was in her late 60s, an age when most people in the 12th century were considered ancient, if they were alive at all. Yet she was at the height of her power. She had outlasted the husband who imprisoned her. She had survived. And now she was ruling the empire he had built. It was the ultimate vindication. She wasn't just a queen mother, she was the acting king. Number 9. What is the price of a king? King Richard the Lionheart was a great warrior, but his crusade was only a partial success. On his way back to England in 1192, he was captured. He was shipwrecked, tried to travel in disguise through the lands of his enemy, Duke Leopold of Austria, and was recognized and taken prisoner. Leopold then handed him over to his overlord, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. The emperor saw a golden opportunity. He demanded a colossal ransom for the release of the King of England. The price was 150,000 marks of silver. It was an astronomical sum, estimated to be 2 to 3 times the annual income of the English crown. The news of Richard's capture was a disaster for England. The kingdom was thrown into crisis. And to make matters worse, Richard's younger brother, Prince John, saw his chance. He began to plot with the King of France, Philip Augustus, to seize the throne for himself. England was facing a political vacuum, a financial crisis, and a rebellion, all at the same time. The person who had to solve all these problems was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, nearly 70 years old, she took charge with incredible energy. She wrote letters to the Pope, pleading for him to intervene and excommunicate the emperor for imprisoning a crusader, which was against church law. But her main task was to raise the money. She crisscrossed England, overseeing the collection of the ransom. She levied a special tax, a 25% tax on both income and property for every person in the realm. The church was ordered to hand over its gold and silver treasures. She organized, she commanded, and she cajoled. She made sure every penny was accounted for. It was a monumental administrative task, one that would have tested any king. But Eleanor did it. She managed to raise the enormous sum, and she did not just send the money. In 1194, she personally escorted the treasure across the continent to Germany. She, an old woman, traveled through hostile territory to deliver the ransom and bring her son home. She stood before the Holy Roman Emperor and negotiated the final terms of Richard's release. She had bought her son's freedom. It was an act of political, financial, and personal will that few monarchs in history have ever matched. She had not just saved her son, she had saved his kingdom. Number 8. Who disciplines a treacherous prince? While Eleanor was working tirelessly to raise the ransom for Richard, her youngest son, John, was making his move. He spread rumors that Richard was dead. He made a deal with King Philip of France, offering to hand over strategic castles in Normandy in exchange for Philip's support for his claim to the English throne. He returned to England and started a rebellion, seizing several important castles, including Windsor. Eleanor was faced with an impossible situation. She was trying to raise a mountain of silver to free one son, while another son was trying to tear the kingdom apart. She did not hesitate. She acted as a king defending his realm. She immediately took command of the forces loyal to Richard. She summoned the great council of the realm, the bishops and barons, and secured their loyalty. She directed the military campaign against her own son. She was the commander-in-chief. Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the king's chief minister, was her loyal deputy. Together, they organized the siege of the castles John had taken. Eleanor herself traveled to the sieges, a formidable presence directing the war effort. Her decisiveness and authority held the kingdom together. The barons, seeing her in command, remained loyal to the absent Richard. John's rebellion quickly faltered. He had underestimated his mother. He expected to face a council of squabbling lords. Instead, he faced the queen. By the time Richard returned to England in March 1194, after Eleanor had delivered the ransom, the rebellion was all but over. John's castles were falling one by one. Richard's return sealed the deal. John was defeated and forced to beg for forgiveness. It was Eleanor who interceded for him. She convinced Richard to pardon his younger brother. It was a shrewd move. She knew the family had to be united to face their external enemy, the King of France. First, she had acted as a king, crushing a rebellion. And then she had acted as a statesman, brokering a peace within her own dynasty. She had faced down a traitor, and he was her own child. This is number 7. Can a mother choose which son becomes king? Richard the Lionheart spent very little time in England. After his return from captivity, he stayed only a few weeks before returning to the continent to fight against King Philip of France to win back the lands he had lost. For the next 5 years, he fought in Normandy and his mother's lands of Aquitaine. Eleanor, though now in her 70s, continued to play a vital role. She managed Aquitaine, her own duchy, ensuring its loyalty to Richard's cause. She was his most trusted advisor and his anchor in the south. Then, in 1199, disaster struck. Richard was besieging a minor castle in Aquitaine when he was shot by a crossbow bolt from the castle walls. The wound was not initially serious, but it became infected. Gangrene set in. It soon became clear that the great warrior king was dying. Eleanor rushed to his side. She was with him when he died. She was 77 years old and had now outlived most of her children. Richard's death created another succession crisis. He had no legitimate children. There were 2 main claimants to the throne. One was his younger brother John. The other was his nephew Arthur of Brittany, the son of his deceased older brother Geoffrey. By the laws of primogeniture that were becoming common, Arthur, the son of the older brother, had the stronger claim. The barons of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine declared their support for Arthur, but Eleanor had other ideas. She knew that Arthur was just a boy. She also knew that he was under the influence of her old enemy, the King of France. She believed that John, for all his faults, was the only one who could hold the sprawling Angevin Empire together. So she acted immediately. Even as she was grieving for Richard, she made a swift political decision. She threw all her immense prestige and authority behind John's claim. She immediately secured Aquitaine for John, forcing her own vassals to swear allegiance to him. And then she rode north, a 77-year-old woman, on a grueling journey to the key territories of Anjou and Touraine. She met with the nobles, she persuaded, she commanded. Her personal intervention was decisive. She was the matriarch of the dynasty, the living embodiment of the empire. Her support gave John the legitimacy he desperately needed. The English barons also accepted John. Thanks to his mother, the man who had been a traitor was now the undisputed King of England. Eleanor had, for the second time, chosen a king. She had put aside personal feelings and legal niceties for the pragmatic survival of her family's empire. Number 6. Why would an 80-year-old woman cross the mountains? In the year 1200, Eleanor, now nearly 80 years old, embarked on her last great journey. Her son, King John, needed to secure peace with his rival, King Philip of France. The best way to do this was through a strategic marriage. Philip agreed to a truce, and part of the deal was that his son and heir, Louis, would marry one of King John's nieces, a princess from the Kingdom of Castile in Spain. The princesses were Eleanor's own granddaughters, the children of her daughter, Eleanor of England, who had married the King of Castile. Someone had to travel to Castile, choose the bride, and escort her back to France. John could have sent a bishop or a nobleman. Instead, he asked his mother, and Eleanor agreed. In the dead of winter, this elderly woman set out from her home in France. She traveled south across the treacherous Pyrenees Mountains. It was an incredibly arduous and dangerous journey, especially for a woman of her age. But she was determined. She was not just a grandmother fetching a bride. She was an ambassador, a queen mother, on a vital diplomatic mission to secure the future of her dynasty. She arrived at the court of Castile and was greeted by her daughter and grandchildren. The original plan was for the elder granddaughter, Urraca, to be the bride. But Eleanor, with her long experience of judging character and politics, made a different choice. She decided that the younger granddaughter, Blanche, was the better candidate. She saw in Blanche the intelligence, strength, and character needed to be a successful Queen of France. Her judgment would prove to be spectacularly correct. Blanche of Castile would go on to become one of the most formidable queens and regents in French history. Having chosen the bride, Eleanor then had to get her back to France. They did not recross the Pyrenees. Instead, they rode through the lands of hostile lords near Bordeaux. At one point, her party was attacked by a rival lord, and her captain was killed. But Eleanor pressed on. She successfully delivered her granddaughter Blanche to be married to the French heir. It was a final, astonishing act of statecraft. At an age when she should have been long retired, she was still on the world stage, making kingly decisions, undertaking dangerous journeys, and shaping the future of two kingdoms. Number 5. Can a castle be defended by will alone? By 1202, the peace Eleanor had worked so hard to achieve had fallen apart. King John's clumsy and arrogant rule had alienated many of his French vassals. War with King Philip of France broke out again, and John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, renewed his claim to the throne with Philip's full support. Arthur, now a teenager, led an army into Eleanor's lands of Poitou. He aimed to capture his grandmother, believing that holding her hostage would be a decisive blow against John. Eleanor was at her castle of Mirabeau. She was 80 years old. Her forces were small. Arthur's army surrounded the castle and laid siege to it. The situation was desperate, but Eleanor was not a helpless old woman waiting to be rescued. She organized the defense of the castle. She managed to get a message out to her son, King John, who was in Normandy, hundreds of miles away. Then she held on. For days, she and her small garrison resisted Arthur's army. The outer walls were breached, but they retreated to the main keep. Eleanor's presence inspired the defenders. The Duchess of Aquitaine was not going to surrender. John received her message and did something remarkable. In one of the most famous forced marches of the medieval era, he covered the distance to Mirabeau in just 48 hours. He arrived unexpectedly and completely surprised the besieging army. The battle was a total victory for John. Arthur of Brittany was captured along with many of his key supporters. Eleanor was saved. Her final act on the public stage was an act of military defiance. She had faced down an enemy army and held a castle until reinforcements arrived. She had shown the same courage and resolve that she had displayed her entire life. She had refused to be a pawn in her grandson's game. She had proven, one last time, that she was a ruler to be reckoned with, and her will had been her strongest fortification. Number 4. Who was the better king of England, Henry or Richard? It's a strange question to ask. Henry II and Richard I were both kings, but their mother, Eleanor, often acted with more kingly authority and wisdom than either of them. Let's look at her husbands first. Louis VII of France was a decent man, but a poor king. He was indecisive, overly pious, and a weak military strategist. And Eleanor, even as his young queen, showed a firmer grasp of strategy and politics during the Second Crusade. She managed to rid herself of him and keep her lands, an act he was powerless to stop. She was clearly more of a king than he was. Her second husband, Henry II, is a more complicated case. Henry was a brilliant, energetic, and effective king. He was a legal reformer, a great administrator, and a military genius. He built the Angevin Empire. For many years, Eleanor was his partner in this project, but his personal flaws, his ruthlessness, his inability to delegate, and his poor treatment of his own family led to constant conflict. His decision to imprison Eleanor for 15 years was an act of political survival, an admission that he could not control her any other way. In their final years, he was a king at war with his entire family, a war he ultimately lost. Eleanor, by contrast, was the one who held the family, and thus the dynasty, together. She inspired loyalty in her sons in a way Henry never could. He built the empire's structure, but she often seemed to be its soul. Then there are her sons. Richard the Lionheart was a legendary warrior, a great general, and the epitome of chivalry. But he was a terrible king of England. He barely spent any time in the country, viewing it merely as a source of funds for his foreign wars. He bled the kingdom dry to pay for his crusade and then to pay for his ransom. While he was away being a hero, it was Eleanor who actually governed England. She ran the administration, raised the taxes, and put down rebellions. She did the hard, unglamorous work of kingship. Richard wore the crown, but Eleanor ruled the kingdom. John had the potential to be a good king. He was intelligent and a skilled administrator, much like his father. But his personality was his downfall. He was suspicious, cruel, and treacherous. His reign was a series of disasters, culminating in the loss of Normandy and most of his French lands, and being forced to sign Magna Carta by his rebellious barons. Throughout the early part of his reign, it was Eleanor's guidance and support that kept him on the throne. She secured his succession and defended his lands. When she died in 1204, his reign went into a steep decline. She had been the bedrock of the Angevin dynasty for over 60 years. Kings came and went. They fought wars, made laws, and made mistakes. But Eleanor was the constant. She was the manager, the diplomat, the regent, the survivor. She may never have been crowned king, but she was often more kingly than the king she was married to or gave birth to. Number 3, what does it mean to build an empire? An empire is more than just a collection of territories on a map. It's a system of laws, a network of loyalties, a shared culture, and a secure line of succession. And Henry II is rightly credited as the architect of the Angevin Empire. His legal and administrative reforms in England were groundbreaking. His energy in holding his vast French territories together was legendary, but he was only half of the equation. And Eleanor was the one who brought the single largest piece of the empire, Aquitaine, to the marriage. Without her, there would have been no empire, just a collection of northern French duchies attached to England. Aquitaine gave the Plantagenet lands their immense scale and wealth, and she was the only one who could truly rule it. Henry tried to impose his will on the rebellious southern lords, but they answered to Eleanor. She was their duchess. She was the key that held the southern half of the empire together. Furthermore, she was the one who produced the heirs. A dynasty is nothing without a future. She gave Henry 5 sons, ensuring the succession. But her role went deeper. When Henry's tyranny threatened to tear the family apart, she sided with her sons. This may seem like treason, but from another perspective, it was an attempt to preserve the empire for the next generation against a father who refused to share power. She was fighting for a different model of empire, one based on a family partnership rather than a single man's absolute rule. After Henry's death, she became the empire's chief executive officer. While Richard was off on his adventures, she managed the home front. She raised the money that fueled his wars. She secured the borders. She maintained the peace. She was the stable center of a realm whose king was perpetually absent. When Richard died, she ensured a smooth, if contentious, succession for John, preventing a civil war that could have destroyed the empire from within. She understood that An empire is not just won on the battlefield, it has to be managed, administered, and passed down. And Henry built the house, but Eleanor was the one who made it a home, defended it from its own master, and ensured it passed to the children. She was not just the mother of kings, she was the mother of the empire itself. Number two, how does a woman's power differ from a man's? In the 12th century, a king's power was direct and obvious. It came from his title, his army, and his ability to enforce laws. A king commanded, he judged, he waged war. Henry II was the model of this kind of power. He was a force of nature, constantly in motion, imposing his will on his kingdom through sheer energy and brilliance. Eleanor's power was different. It was more complex, more subtle, and in many ways more resilient. Yes, she had direct power as Duchess of Aquitaine. She was a feudal lord with vassals and an army, but much of her influence came from other sources. She wielded soft power long before the term was invented. Her court at Poitiers shaped the culture of Europe. She didn't issue a law demanding chivalry, she made it fashionable. She attracted the greatest minds and artists of her day, and through them, her influence spread far beyond her borders. Her power also came from her role as a matriarch. She was the mother of kings and queens. Her children sat on the thrones of England, Sicily, and Castile. This family network gave her a unique international influence. She was the linchpin of a dynasty. Her personal relationships were a form of statecraft. Even her imprisonment was a source of a strange, passive power. She became a symbol of resistance to Henry's tyranny, a cause for her sons to rally around. Her endurance was a political statement. When she was regent, she exercised direct, kingly power. She issued writs, commanded armies, and raised taxes. But she always did so with a keen understanding of the people she was ruling. Her first act upon her release was an amnesty, a gesture of goodwill that earned her immense popularity. She knew that power was not just about command, it was about earning loyalty. Henry ruled through fear and respect. Richard ruled through his heroic reputation. John tried to rule through fear and failed. Eleanor ruled through a combination of authority, intelligence, diplomacy, and a deep understanding of her people. She showed that a woman's power, forced to operate in different ways, could be just as effective and ultimately more enduring than a man's. Number one, what is Eleanor of Aquitaine's true legacy? Eleanor of Aquitaine lived for 82 years, an astonishingly long life for the 12th century. She was born the daughter of a duke and died the grandmother of kings and emperors. She was, at various times, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, a crusader, a rebel, a prisoner, and a regent. She outlived 8 of her 10 children. She saw the rise of the Angevin Empire, and she lived to see the beginning of its fall. So, what is her legacy? It is not one single thing. She was not a great builder of castles like her husband Henry, nor a legendary warrior like her son Richard. Her legacy is more profound. She redefined what it meant to be a queen. Before Eleanor, queens were largely seen as political wives and mothers of heirs. They were important, but their power was indirect, exercised through their husbands and sons. Eleanor shattered that mold. She was a ruler in her own right before she was ever a queen. She never let anyone forget that. She insisted on a role as a partner, not a possession. Her life was a testament to the power of resilience. She faced repeated betrayals. Her first husband was a disappointment. Her second husband, the great love and great rival of her life, imprisoned her for a quarter of her adult life. Her sons rebelled. She saw them fight each other and die young. Yet she never broke. She endured 15 years in a cell and emerged, not as a victim, but as a ruler. She took grief and failure and forged them into a new kind of power, the power of the survivor. She is also a legacy of female authority. In an age utterly dominated by men, she commanded armies, ruled kingdoms, and engaged in high-stakes diplomacy. She did it in her 20s as Queen of France, in her 40s at her court in Poitiers, in her 60s as Regent of England, and in her 80s as an ambassador crossing the mountains. She proved that a woman's intellect, will, and courage were in no way inferior to a man's. Perhaps her greatest legacy is the sheer force of her personality, a life lived so fully and on such a grand scale that it still fascinates us nearly 1,000 years later. She was not a saint, She was a pragmatic, ambitious, and sometimes ruthless politician. She made choices that led to war and suffering, but she was always undeniably the master of her own fate in a world that did everything it could to deny her that right. She was a duchess who was a queen, but in her actions, her will, and her incredible endurance, she was more of a king than any of the men who wore the crown beside her.